Hi, this is Randy Wykoff, the Dean of the College of Public Health at East Tennessee State University, and I'm pleased to provide the 92nd weekly pandemic update with data accurate through February 17th, 2022. Today, I'm going to pose two questions. Is the pandemic coming to an end? And how is the U.S. doing compared to the rest of the world? These are questions that other folks have asked, of course. And so the question is the pandemic finally coming to an end? So let's take a look at the data. There are some good news here. As we've mentioned before, the number of cases globally is clearly coming down, and the number of deaths appears to have turned the corner to come down, leaving us right now just a little under 6 million total deaths. In the US, we're seeing an even more dramatic reduction in cases, a reduction in hospitalizations, and a several-week reduction in deaths, leaving us now just under 1 million deaths. If we look at where cases have been over the last 2 months, we saw this exploding number where it was everywhere in the country. And then last week and the week before, we started seeing it easing out a little bit. And now this week, if you look at it, the biggest cluster is right here in Central Appalachia, with a little bit of a cluster in Florida. And the reason I mentioned that is you may recall that last year's surge began in Florida. So we'll keep an eye on this. This is maybe evidence that the numbers there are decreasing and just haven't decreased, the same way they haven't decreased quite as much in Appalachia. But if it's a new surge, we need to keep an eye on it. In terms of Tennessee, we're seeing reduced number of cases, reduced number of hospitalizations, though not quite as much as we're seeing nationally, and a slow but apparently steady reduction in the number of deaths, leaving us at about a little less than 23,500 deaths to date. In terms of the ballot health service area, we've seen a very quick 1-week drop with 342 patients. 85% are not fully vaccinated. Of the 56 in the ICU, 89% are not fully vaccinated. And of the 37 that are intubated, 95%. So I'm not going to answer this question just yet because I want to get back to the second question, which I think will inform the first. And how is the U.S. doing compared to the rest of the world? Well, those of you who've been with us from the beginning will remember in April of 2020, we laid out all the countries in the world for which we had data and the number of deaths per million. That we felt was the best metric, right? Cases depends on how much testing you do. Total deaths depend on your population, but deaths per million is the rate that seems most reasonable. And at the time, Belgium had the highest rate in the world, about 4 times higher than the US. And we followed that for every week for a while. We saw increasing numbers. And then we finally got to the point where we realized we really couldn't keep doing this, in part because some countries were starting to get worse than others, and this order that they were originally in didn't make a lot of sense. So we switched to a slightly different way of displaying the data, showing here the top 17 countries in the world for deaths per million. Just a few months later, you see those numbers have increased quite a bit. And then what we saw over time is a couple of things. One, the US was still hanging out in the top 10, but increasingly we were seeing cases now. In the beginning, they were all in Europe, North America, but now increasing the number in South America. And this reflects something that we've been seeing for the entire epidemic. We talk a lot about the ebb and flow of the total number of deaths, but you can see here in the beginning, it was largely in the Americas, followed by a cluster in Europe, and then both, and then South Asia. And over time, where the deaths are occurring changes quite a bit. So let's take a look now. Let's compare where we were in the very beginning, April 2020, almost 2 years ago, with where we are today. And what you can see is the US is still in the top 10, even though our numbers have increased 17-fold. And you can see the numbers at the top. And what's interesting, a couple of things, obviously, more countries in the Americas, more countries in Eastern Europe. And really, besides the United States, the only 2 countries that are still in the top 17 that were there before are Belgium and Italy, which are down now well below the U.S. So how is the U.S. doing compared to the rest of the world? We stay about the same. Now, why does this inform that first question? Because it gives you a sense of how I'm going to answer the question. So is the pandemic coming to an end? No one knows for sure. Let's look at cases in the US. Right? This is where we were through last summer. We had this big spike in cases, and then it came down. And by June of last year, June of 2021, it looked like things were pretty much over. None of us predicted that there would be a fall surge, especially because we thought, well, if it's seasonal, we're going to see a surge if we're going to see one in the wintertime. And then, of course, nobody had any idea that we were going to see the kind of surge that we saw with Omicron. So no one knows for sure what's going to happen. It appears that the current surge, the Omicron surge, is coming to an end. That's what we expected. But, even with all this good news, the death rates are still very high. If you look globally, 10,000 deaths a day, higher than it's been at almost any time except the two major peaks. If you look at the US, about 2,000 deaths a day, again, higher than it's been at much of the time. So even if the pandemic is slowing down, it is still burning very, very hot. And one of the things that makes predicting the future so difficult with this pandemic is that we're seeing very different patterns. These are the 9 countries in the world with the most deaths, not the highest death rate, just the most deaths. I just picked them that way. And what you can see is very different patterns, some huge numbers increasing over time, some very narrow spikes. And you realize when you look at this, the one thing that's clear is, yes, we see this up and down pattern, but it appears to be very different in different places. And I think we're seeing 3 conflicting trends that make it difficult to predict the future. One, obviously, we're getting more immunity from vaccination and from natural infection. All that spike in Omicron cases will give us some level of immunity along with vaccination. But at the same time, the virus is spreading widely around the world, especially in those countries where vaccination rates are even lower than ours. And we really don't know that much about waning immunity. How long will our immunity protect us? So in October, you may recall, we put up this slide and we said, okay, and this was before Omicron. We said, okay, based on the number of deaths that we're seeing, what's likely to happen? And we said there could be 3 possible outcomes. One, you see this sort of decrease down and finally gets to 0, that we're sort of moving downhill. The second option was we might see just sort of this undulating pattern continuing on sort of ad infinitum. And then the other pattern was we would see a spike in deaths. And the truth is, in October, we didn't know, and now we don't know. So let's take a look at what really happened. This was October. I'm going to superimpose February 17th. And what you can see is it's just this continued pattern. The numbers haven't dropped really very much. There's been another surge, which is higher than the previous one. So again, at the end of the day, we have to say the pandemic may be slowing down, but it's not coming to an end yet. We still need to get people vaccinated and make important choices. If you're ill, having any upper respiratory symptoms, don't be around other people. For the moment, the CDC is still recommending masking in certain situations. We'll keep an eye on that. And how's the US doing compared to the rest of the world? About the same. We're still in the top 10 in terms of death per million. We'll keep an eye on both of these trends over time. A great deal more information about COVID-19 on the College of Public Health website. Please feel free to share these videos with anyone you know. I heard recently that a popular podcast gets between 10 and 15 million views a week. I will tell you that we're not at that level just yet. I'd like to thank Dara Young for editing, producing, and posting this video. If you have any questions about what I've said today or any questions about the pandemic in general, please let me know. I look forward to hearing from you. Until next week, please be well. Thank you.